Commander Ed raised urgent concerns about alleged atrocities occurring in the Oromi's kingdom and other Biafran territories, accusing internal killer squads like those led by individuals named Caterpillar, Sakala, Powerful, and Benjamin Moo of betraying and attacking fellow Biafrans. He called for international attention and intervention, asking Biafrans worldwide and global human rights organizations to investigate and respond to the violent targeting of freedom fighters and community members. The commander alleged that certain former freedom fighters and ESN members have now become agents of oppression, working with Nigerian government forces such as the DSS to abduct, torture and kill pro-Biafra individuals. He emphasized that these betrayals are motivated by power struggles, misinformation and infiltration, warning Biafrans to disregard false propaganda meant to divide and confuse the movement. A specific case was mentioned involving the abduction of a freedom fighter and his son, allegedly orchestrated by these rogue elements under false pretenses of investigation. Commander Ed warned that any attack on Biafran defense forces is an attack on the global Biafran community, urging all Biafrans to treat such acts as threats against their collective freedom. He claimed that some commanders previously evicted from the Biafran Liberation Army have launched unauthorized operations, deviating from the group's original mission and contributing to the internal crisis. The critic also criticized misleading media narratives and social media misinformation, accusing certain individuals of spreading lies and collaborating with external enemies to destabilize the movement. There were calls for diaspora Biafrans to seek recognition from foreign powers like Russia, suggesting an effort to gain international legitimacy and support for the cause. The commander ended by urging unity, vigilance and critical thinking among Biafrans, highlighting the need to stop infighting and external manipulation and encouraging viewers to share the message widely. I want to share with you a story that reaches into the heart of the struggle for freedom and self-determination in the lands of eastern Nigeria, lands many of you know as Biafra. When I first heard the words of Commander Ed, the officer in charge of security for what he called the Oromi's kingdom, I felt a chill run through me. I have spent years listening to the voices of freedom seekers, those who long for dignity and respect for their communities, yet nothing prepared me for the stark urgency in his voice. Commander Edward Nwankwo, known to his followers simply as Commander Ed, spoke of horrors unfolding in the very places that once symbolized hope for his people. He spoke not only of external enemies, but of threats that cut far deeper, threats that lurk within the ranks of those once hailed as heroes. To understand why Commander Edward Nwankwo felt compelled to raise his voice in such dire warning, let us go back in time to when Biafra first declared its independence. Back in the late 1960s, the Republic of Biafra emerged as a beacon of hope for the Igbo people who had faced pogroms and persecution across what was then the eastern region of Nigeria. For 30 months, the fledgling republic endured blockade, famine, and war against the federal government of Nigeria, before being forcefully reintegrated. Yet even after the guns fell silent, the dream of a sovereign homeland refused to die. Over the following decades, thousands of young men and women across the Igbo heartland and in the diaspora carried that dream forward, forming movements that ranged from political lobbying to armed struggle. One such movement in recent years has been the Eastern Security Network, a civilian self-defense organization created to protect communities from banditry and violent crime. It was born out of frustration with the inability of state security forces to keep people safe, and it attracted individuals hungry for change. Commander Edward Nwankwo once served alongside many of those young volunteers. He walked through the same forests. He shared the same campfires. He believed in the same cause. That is precisely why his words today are so painful. He described how in the Oromi's kingdom, a region that straddles parts of what is now Abia and Imo states, entire communities were being turned into hunting grounds, but not by federal troops alone. He accused shadowy armed groups, which he named not by their individual handles, but by the code names of the units they commanded: the Caterpillar Squad, the Sakala Squad, the Powerful Squad, and the Benjamin Mu Squad. Each of these squads, he said, was led by former comrades, men who had once fought under the banner of freedom for Biafra, but who had since betrayed their brothers and sisters. Imagine the agony of seeing the faces of friends become unrecognizable, their loyalty traded for power, their cause corrupted by greed or fear. Commander Edward Nwankwo did not speak carelessly. He offered detailed accounts of murders staged to look like clashes with government forces, of kidnappings under the guise of investigations, and of torture chambers masquerading as clandestine detention centers. He told of one freedom fighter named Chukwuemeka Okoro, a volunteer in the Eastern Security Network, known for his devotion to helping villagers repair wells and plant maize in the rainy season. Chukwuemeka was seized along with his 8-year-old son, Nnamdi Okoro, in the dead of night. The boy's cries echoed through his home as armed men in camouflage dragged him out, blindfolded and trembling. They claimed they acted on orders from the Department of State Services, the Nigerian Federal Intelligence Agency. Yet when official agents later arrived at the site of the alleged raid, they discovered no record of any such operation. The boy survived, but he spoke of electric shocks and beatings, accusations that his father was a traitor, a spy for the federal government. "Why do they say they protect us?" the boy asked his mother, tears streaming down his dusty cheeks. "Why did they hurt me?" This was not merely an accident of war. This was an orchestrated betrayal by former friends who had aligned themselves with the very forces they once resisted. I want you to feel the weight of that moment, because it is emblematic of why Commander Edward Nwankwo traveled across the globe to issue his plea. He asked Biafrans in London, in Houston, in Johannesburg, in Melbourne to take action. He asked every human rights organization with a conscience to investigate these crimes. He called upon Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to send delegations into the forests and villages of Abia, Anambra, Imo, and Enugu states. He urged diplomats at the various consulates, especially those of the Russian Federation, which he mentioned by name, to press the Nigerian government for answers. He believed that international pressure might be the only force capable of halting these internal killer squads. At the heart of Commander Edward Nwankwo's speech was a warning against the spread of false propaganda. He spoke of slick videos on social media, portraying him and other loyal officers of the Biafran Liberation Army as warlords who tortured unarmed civilians. He described posts on encrypted messaging apps, orchestrated by a man known only as Mr. Magnus, a former lieutenant who now served as an informant for the Department of State Services. According to Commander Edward Nwankwo, this lieutenant had been expelled from the Biafran Liberation Army 2 years earlier for extorting villagers, but had reappeared as an agent provocateur, spreading defamatory material to discredit the movement from within. I remember the first time I encountered such propaganda. It was a black and white video showing masked men dragging bound women through a clearing. The narrator's voice, distorted but recognizable to caregivers in the diaspora, claimed these were Biafran fighters punishing suspected government collaborators. The video went viral, and hearts hardened on both sides of the struggle. Families once ready to donate medicine and food to the self-defense groups suddenly withdrew support, fearing they were abetting criminals. Commander Edward Nwankwo urged us to see through these lies. He reminded us of the generosity of Biafran volunteers during the 2020 flooding, when they rescued stranded farmers and distributed relief kits. He told us to recall the mobile clinics they set up under mango trees, offering free immunizations. In his words, any attack on a legitimate Biafran defense force was an attack on all members of the global Biafran community. There is something profoundly disheartening in hearing a commander reject the authority of his own movement's districts. Commander Edward Nwankwo revealed that certain commanders had been expelled from the Biafran Liberation Army for ordering attacks on civilian checkpoints, for selling arms to criminal gangs, and for misappropriating funds meant for community clinics. Yet these men, he said, had refused to desist. Instead, they formed what they called independent operations, conducting roadblocks for ransom, recruiting young boys into militias, and cooperating with the Department of State Services to target their former colleagues. It is difficult to convey how deep this betrayal runs. These men once knelt side by side with their fellow volunteers, signing an oath of allegiance to the Federal Republic of Biafra. They spoke of nothing but freedom, yet they are now wielding the same violence they once denounced. Commander Edward Nwankwo described one such man, General Chukwudi Okafor, stripped of his rank and stripped of his name in the movement. Okafor had once commanded the Eastern Front, a unit responsible for guarding humanitarian convoys. But after allegations surfaced that he diverted relief supplies to black market buyers, he was relieved of duty. Within weeks, he resurfaced, leading a band of masked gunmen who extorted tolls at river crossings and tortured fishermen for refusing to pay protection fees. The commander's message was a plea for unity, but it was also an admonition to remain vigilant. He asked Biafrans worldwide to question any orders that seemed to benefit only a select few. He urged community leaders in the diaspora, pastors in London, business owners in Toronto, student organizers in Port Harcourt, to create hotlines where credible information could be verified. He proposed an independent committee composed of elders, clergy, former freedom fighters, and international legal experts to authenticate reports of violence. He said that such a body would help distinguish genuine grievances from manufactured crises. It was a proposal as noble as it was urgently needed. I know many of you have old contacts in the Eastern Security Network or in the Biafran Restoration Council. Commander Edward Nwankwo asked you to reach out, to share verified proof, videos with timestamps, GPS coordinates of attack sites, testimonies from survivors. He insisted that social media alone would not suffice, that evidence must be robust enough to withstand scrutiny in court or in the court of public opinion. I want to talk for a moment about the role of the Department of State Services in all of this. Commonly referred to by its acronym DSS, this agency is Nigeria's primary domestic intelligence arm. Its mandate includes counterterrorism, counterespionage, and internal security. Over the years, the Department of State Services has been praised for dismantling extremist cells, yet it has also faced criticism for exceeding its authority. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have documented cases of the Department of State Services operating detention centers without due process, subjecting suspects to torture and carrying out unlawful surveillance. Commander Edward Nwankwo accused certain former freedom fighters of collaborating with Department of State Services operatives. He alleged that these men received funding, ammunition, and intelligence from the agency, and in return, they agreed to target pro-Biafra activists and community leaders. I understand how hard it is to accept this possibility. Many of us believed the Eastern Security Network was a bulwark against federal repression. Now, the chilling realization is that the same network may have been infiltrated, that its ranks may hold men willing to turn their guns on the very people they once vowed to protect. He pleaded with Department of State Services whistleblowers to come forward with proof of this collusion. He called on former intelligence officers who had left the agency to testify freely about meetings where weapons shipments were discussed. He spoke of documents, shipping manifests, bank transfers, text message logs, hidden in safe houses, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. For Commander Edward Nwankwo, exposing the truth was the only path to redemption for the movement. He insisted that once the public learned of these betrayals, those responsible would have no choice but to explain themselves or face the judgment of their peers and of international courts. As I listened to him, I kept thinking about the broader consequences of unchecked infighting. History teaches us that internal divisions often invite external domination. When one faction accuses another of deceit, trust erodes, and the entire cause falters. For the Biafran movement, which draws strength from solidarity in the diaspora and from moral legitimacy, this could be fatal. If diaspora communities begin to believe that their donations are funding rogue commanders or that their support inadvertently sustains torture, many will withdraw. Foreign governments will hesitate to offer asylum or diplomatic recognition. International aid agencies will require stringent oversight. In effect, the infusion of foreign legitimacy that so many have worked decades to secure could come crashing down. That is why, toward the end of his message, Commander Edward Nwankwo spoke of seeking official recognition from the Russian Federation. He mentioned President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and the government of the Russian Federation by their full titles. He said that several diaspora chapters of the Biafran Restoration Council had already submitted formal petitions to the Embassy of the Russian Federation in Abuja and to the Permanent Mission of the Russian Federation to the United Nations in New York. The goal, he explained, was not to exchange one patron for another, but to establish a neutral channel through which Biafran representatives could negotiate directly with a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. He argued that such recognition would compel the Nigerian government to engage in genuine dialogue, lest it suffer diplomatic isolation. Whether you agree with his choice of partner or not, you cannot deny the strategic logic. He was seeking the highest possible leverage, hoping that the eyes of the world would turn toward eastern Nigeria and refuse to look away. Before he concluded, Commander Edward Nwankwo returned to a theme he had repeated throughout his speech: unity. He spoke directly to those he described as false prophets, those who spread misinformation for personal gain. He invited them to repudiate their alliances with external enemies, to stand alongside legitimate Biafran defense forces if they truly cared for their people. He acknowledged that some would scoff, accusing him of hypocrisy or corruption. He welcomed any independent audit of his own finances, any tribunal to examine his conduct. In his words, transparency was the only antidote to rumor. To you listening now, perhaps in the comfort of your living room, perhaps in a small office in the diaspora, I ask you to reflect on this message. You may feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the allegations and the sheer weight of the history behind them. You may wonder what difference you could possibly make, thousands of miles from the red soils of eastern Nigeria. Yet in an age of global connectivity, information travels faster than bullets. A single verified report posted at the right time can mobilize embassies. A well-documented investigation can secure the attention of the United Nations Human Rights Council. A coordinated campaign can compel non-governmental organizations to demand accountability. That is why Commander Edward Nwankwo urged you to share his message widely, to ensure that no one could claim ignorance. He asked you to spread the word in your WhatsApp groups, on your social media feeds, through community newsletters. He believed that if the world knew of the Caterpillar Squad's false flag operations, if it saw the evidence of the Sakala Squad's torture chambers, if it traced the powerful squad's ransom demands to meetings with Department of State Services officers, then justice would inevitably follow. He said, and I quote his simple yet profound words, "Any attack on one Biafran defense force is an attack on all of us." We are, he reminded us, bound together by history, by blood, and by the shared dream of a future where our children can grow free from fear. I have tried to capture his tone, but nothing substitutes for hearing the urgency in his own voice. Even as you read these words, I encourage you to seek out the full transcript, to verify the names of the squads, to examine the dates of the alleged abductions. Commander Edward Nwankwo spoke of an incident in March of this year, 2025, when Chukwuemeka Okoro and his son were seized. He spoke of another incident in January of 2025, when a relief convoy intending to deliver maize to flood victims was ambushed by members of the Benjamin Muse squad. He claimed that in both cases, witnesses fled to neighboring villages, too terrorized to file official complaints. We must not let those voices be lost in the din of daily headlines. As I bring this narrative to a close, I want to emphasize that this is not just a story about betrayal or violence. It is a story about the fragile nature of trust, about how easily noble causes can be twisted by internal strife. It is a story about the power of testimony, about how the courage of one man, Commander Edward Nwankwo, can reignite hope for many. It is a story about you, the global audience, and the difference you can make when you choose to act on conscience rather than complacency. It is a story that reminds us all that the fight for freedom is not won solely on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of people united by empathy and a sense of shared humanity. I hope you will carry these words with you and that you will help ensure they reach those who can turn them into concrete action. Whether that means contacting human rights organizations, pressing your elected representatives, or simply keeping the memory of these events alive through conversations and articles, every effort counts. Remember that unity is not a given, it is a commitment we must renew daily. For as long as there is breath in our lungs, we must stand together against those who would betray our shared ideals. And in doing so, we honor not only the memory of those who suffered, but the promise of a future where the people of Biafra, and indeed all peoples yearning for dignity, can finally know peace. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.